There are whispers buried beneath the soil of West Virginia, bones that shift in the dirt when no one's looking. If you press your ear to the floorboards of the old Whitaker house on Miller's Fork Road, you won't hear ghosts. You'll hear something worse, the sound of secrets too twisted for the living, secrets the dead were forced to keep. This isn't just a forgotten family history. It's a coded warning, a pattern hidden in bloodlines, silence, and shadows. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is the story of the Whitakers, and the forbidden legacy of America's most disturbing blood pact. The records are fractured, deliberately perhaps, a few newspaper clippings, whispers in court transcripts, and one sealed envelope marked, "Do not open ever." But beneath the surface lies something far older than the 20th century. This tale doesn't begin with the birth of a child or the death of a matriarch. It begins with a choice. A choice made in 1892, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, when Henry Whitaker refused to bury his brother the Christian way. They say Henry dug the grave wrong, shallow, crooked, facing west, away from God. That night, the dogs howled, the sky split, and the Whitaker name was no longer spoken in town without a glance over the shoulder. 3 generations later, what remained of the family was barely human. Twisted bodies, slurred speech, children who couldn't name their own parents. The townsfolk called them inbred monsters, backwoods freaks. But the truth was far darker than incest. It was an experiment, not of medicine, but of obedience. No one talks about where the money came from, or why a government vehicle was seen leaving the property in 1957, carrying crates of bones and blood samples. The official records were scrubbed, but the local sheriff, long retired and deep in whiskey, confessed once they were breeding something up too. Here, not like animals, not like people either, something else. And the most terrifying part, they succeeded. This isn't a story, it's a pattern, and the moment you hear it, really hear it, a part of you changes forever. We begin now, but I warn you, we don't come back the same. The Whitaker property wasn't on any real map. You had to know someone who owed a favor or a blood debt, to find the overgrown trail that snaked through the holler. Locals warned never to follow it past dusk. But in 1946, a 23-year-old social worker named Evelyn Maris ignored every warning. She had been assigned to investigate claims of neglect and child abnormalities in the rural fringes of Raleigh County. What she found, she never wrote in any report, but her personal journal, buried in a box of sealed county archives, tells the real story. Evelyn wrote of children who did not speak, only stared, of rooms without furniture, lit only by oil lamps, where drawings of spirals and symbols lined the walls in charcoal. She described a man called Lurton Whitaker, barefoot, sun-leathered, eyes glassy like dead river fish, who spoke in tongues even she couldn't identify. And then there was the matriarch, a woman they called Mother June. Evelyn said she never saw Mother June walk, only sit in a wicker chair with wheels, her skin as white as candle wax, her hands permanently clenched like claws. And yet, despite her condition, everyone deferred to her, even the men. Evelyn wrote, "She watches you without blinking, like she's measuring your soul." There were no formal records of birth, school, or work, and yet food came regularly. Supplies, clothing, even books, delivered in unmarked crates dropped off by silent men who never left their vehicles. When Evelyn asked where it all came from, Lurton pointed to the hills and said, "From above." At first she thought it was religious madness, but the symbols carved into the barn's wooden beams matched none from any Bible. They were older, geometric, ritualistic, and drawn in what she feared might not have been paint. She returned to town the next morning, pale and shaking. Her report listed insufficient evidence to justify intervention. Then she quit, disappeared 6 months later. Her body was never found, but her notebook was. Pages torn, blood on the spine. Final entry read, "They weren't neglected, they were cultivated." Whatever was happening on that land wasn't just a product of isolation. It was designed, protected, fed, and it was only just beginning. There's a reason no one in Raleigh County speaks the Whitaker name above a whisper. It's not fear of superstition, it's fear of memory, because those who remember too clearly tend to vanish. And in 1961, something happened that nearly brought the whole secret crashing down. A fire. Not started by lightning, not by accident, started by someone inside. It was late October. Locals recall the sky was unnaturally red that night. Not from flame, but something else. Heat without fire. Pressure without sound. At 2:13 a.m., the Whitakers' main barn exploded in a column of light that was seen from 15 miles away. The next day, the sheriff arrived to investigate. What he found were ashes, burnt soil, and bones. Not just animal, not just human. Something in between. Witnesses described vertebrae too long for a child, but too narrow for a man. Finger bones fused at the knuckles, jawlines with no room for teeth, and skulls with shallow sockets, flat faces, and holes bored clean through the center of the forehead, as if something had been inserted or removed. The sheriff made one call to a number in D.C., and by nightfall, 2 government sedans had arrived, lights off, plates removed. Within hours, the property was declared a closed zone for ecological study. But here's where the story twists. The very next week, 3 members of the Whitaker family, Lurton, Jeb, and a young boy named Curtis, showed up in Charleston. They were barefoot, silent, and carrying nothing but a half-burned journal. They entered a church during Mass, walked to the altar, and dropped the book on the floor before collapsing. The journal was confiscated by federal agents before the town ever saw its contents. But one line, written on the first page in shaky charcoal, was remembered by the priest who read it before it was taken. We were told it would bring salvation, but it brought something else. Oh, see, something that lives inside the blood. Lurton never spoke again. Curtis died within weeks. Jeb vanished during transport to a state hospital. And the barn's remains? Bulldozed, buried, reforested. But the land didn't forget, and neither did whatever they'd awakened beneath it. We're not talking about madness anymore. We're talking about engineered inheritance, altered bloodlines, the kind that twist evolution into obedience, the kind you don't choose but inherit. By 1973, the whispers about the Whitaker land had turned into something else, silence. Not the kind born of forgetting, but of forced forgetting. Maps began showing the property as Federal Reserve. Locals stopped hunting near it. Even the birds seemed to avoid the tree line. It was as if nature itself had drawn a boundary. But one man refused to forget. His name was Conrad Bell, a retired Army cryptographer turned amateur genealogist. He had no family left, no career either, thanks to a nervous breakdown during a covert assignment in Southeast Asia. But he had one obsession: genetic anomalies in isolated populations. He came to West Virginia in 1971 under the guise of writing a book about Appalachian lineages. What he was really tracing was the Whitaker blood. Conrad had discovered records hidden in microfiche rolls at the Library of Congress, files that had been misfiled under agricultural study, but contained genetic sequencing data with no attribution. Only one subject group was listed: subject line W62W93, ages, heights, brain measurements, bone density, and something else: neurostructural divergence, 18%, behavioral compliance, 92%, language degradation, 77%, emotional variance, 3%. Those weren't medical records, they were experiment logs. Conrad followed the trail to Raleigh County, rented a small cabin 2 miles from the old Whitaker property, disguised himself as a census worker, and one morning in August, he crossed the boundary line. What he found was a ruin, and a signal. The barn was gone, the house had collapsed into itself, blackened timbers swallowed by vines, but something was still humming beneath the soil, a low, rhythmic pulse you couldn't hear with your ears, only feel in your teeth. He followed it to what remained of the cellar, and down there, under the foundation, was a concrete door bolted with rusted steel. No hinges, no hand. Just a symbol scorched into the surface, a spiral, inside a triangle, inside a circle. The same glyph that had shown up in a CIA psychic warfare manual Conrad had translated 12 years earlier. He took photographs, sent one to a contact at Langley. 2 days later, the cabin he was renting burned to the ground with him inside it. The official story? Faulty propane tank. The real story? His photographs vanished. But one leaked, and it's been circulating on deep forums for decades. Ask the right people and they'll tell you, it's not just the Whitakers. That symbols appeared in Montana, Alaska, and a small town in Arizona where every child born in 1989 had heterochromia and spoke fluent Latin by age 6. You still think this is just about one family? No, this was a prototype. There's a line most people won't cross, not because they're cowards, but because they still believe the lie of normalcy, the illusion that the world is rational, that governments protect, religions guide, and families love. But the Whitaker story was designed to shatter that lie, and in 1980, it nearly did. That year, a document surfaced under strange circumstances. It wasn't found in a file cabinet or library. It was discovered buried in a lead-lined box behind the altar of a burned-down church just 10 miles from the old Whitaker land. The box was stamped with one word, Custos, Latin for guardian. Inside were 34 pages of handwritten transcripts, diagrams, and confessions. No author name, just a title across the first page. Genome Project, Lineage Seeding, Group WU13. Experimental subtype, obedience via degeneration. The contents were horrifying. The document outlined a black budget initiative dating back to 1938, funded through shell corporations connected to chemical conglomerates and Department of Agriculture think tanks. The goal? Not to improve rural populations, but to observe what happens when you deliberately sabotage the evolutionary process in an isolated gene pool. What they wanted to create wasn't strength. It was pliability. The documents revealed that the Whitakers had been selected, not for their proximity or piety, but for their psychological profile, passive under pressure, easily ritualized, deeply hierarchical, and genetically predisposed to high suggestibility. They were perfect vessels for something older than policy, a theory born in the fires of eugenics, cloaked in the language of faith. But the most chilling part wasn't what they did to the family, it was what they documented after. Reports spoke of changes in the children, neural development that ignored language but increased pattern recognition, absence of fear response in threatening environments, spontaneous coordination between siblings without verbal communication. One case of a child who stared at a mirror for 12 straight hours, then carved a spiral into his own chest without flinching. The last page of the file contained a warning, written in red ink, "Terminate the site. The blood has begun to listen." This wasn't science. It was sorcery, disguised in a lab coat, hidden in census data, and fueled by a belief older than government. Control the family, and you control the future. You wanted the truth? You're in it now, and this rabbit hole has no bottom. Most people believe evil comes with fire and fury, but the deepest kind, the institutional kind, moves with paperwork, policy, and plausible deniability. It wears the face of a neighbor. It speaks the language of protection. That's how the Whitaker Project survived, long after the last Whitaker house collapsed. It simply changed its name. In 1984, a new program was launched quietly under the Department of Health and Human Services, officially called Rural Family Wellness Initiative. Unofficially, Echo Protocol. Its target zones were scattered across West Virginia, Kentucky, and parts of Tennessee. Every location mapped over areas with suspected genetic anomalies. The stated mission? Improve health outcomes in high-risk families. What it actually did was far more sinister. Under Echo Protocol, children from these families were taken into specialized learning facilities. Parents signed consent forms they couldn't read. Blood samples were collected monthly. Neurological stimulation tests were performed at night under sedation, and a new phrase began appearing in the internal documents: Behavioral Obedience Index. One of these facilities, codenamed Hollow Bridge, was built just 17 miles from the original Whitaker land. Declassified fragments show that Hollow Bridge wasn't just a school, it was a control lab. Children were raised without traditional language, taught to communicate through symbols, tones, and synchronized behavior. They were exposed to high-frequency sound arrays, fed nutrient-altered diets, and subjected to sleep deprivation rotations masked as spiritual cleansing. One experiment involved locking 12 children in an underground chamber for 72 hours with only a single photo on the wall, the Whitaker family portrait. The result? 9 children stopped speaking entirely, 1 bit off his own finger, and 2 began drawing spirals on the walls with their blood, repeating a phrase in unison. Blood remembers, blood remembers, blood remembers. The program was officially shut down in 1987. The buildings were destroyed, records sealed, and yet the results didn't vanish. The last surviving child from Hollow Bridge, known only as Subject W Delta 7, was tracked to a psych facility in Idaho in 1992. Staff claimed he could sense emotions in others with terrifying precision. He never blinked, never cried, but when asked where he came from, he answered in perfect Latin, "From the well where silence drinks." And here's the question no one dares to ask. What if this wasn't an isolated experiment, but a model? Because the techniques tested on the Whitakers are now being used in systems you interact with every day. Obedience, repetition, isolation, identity fragmentation. You thought this was history? No, this was the blueprint. By the early 1990s, those in the know had stopped calling it the Whitaker case. They had a new term for it, the West Line divergence, because what started as a backwoods anomaly had revealed something far more valuable, something they could use, not just to alter individuals, but to manipulate generations. The experiment had proven one thing beyond dispute: identity can be erased from the inside out, and that discovery was priceless. The methods were no longer hidden in barns or whispered in bloodline rituals. They were refined, streamlined, and most importantly, legalized. Under new federal mandates in 1996, behavioral harmony assessments were quietly embedded in rural schooling programs across 5 states. But they weren't testing math. They were mapping suggestibility thresholds. If a child failed the test, he got extra tutoring, special classes, a social worker who made frequent home visits. But if he passed, if he proved resistant to manipulation, he was flagged, cataloged, watched. The name of the database? Obsidian Orchard. It cross-referenced genealogy, school behavior, medical history, and even church attendance. And guess whose descendants were tagged in red? The Whitaker line, or what was left of it, because not all of them had died. In 1999, a journalist named Jacob Rourke published a single article in a fringe magazine titled, "They're Still Here." It was dismissed as conspiracy fiction, but Rourke had been embedded with a remote religious sect in rural Virginia, calling themselves the Sons of the Spiral, all former Whitaker relatives, all off-grid, and all repeating the same phrase during prayer: "The blood remembers what the mind cannot." Rourke disappeared 3 weeks after publication. His apartment was found empty, computer wiped, notes gone. Only thing left behind, a single photograph. It showed a boy, around 12, standing in the woods, holding a dead crow, eyes pale, head tilted, spiral tattoo burned into his chest. And on the back of the photo, scrawled in marker, "Subject Delta 13, Stage 4 Emergence." The Whitaker project never ended, it just changed clothes. You may think this is folklore, but if you've noticed society growing more compliant, more divided, more asleep, you're seeing the ripple effects. The same techniques tested on a single family are now baked into every system around you. So ask yourself, are you sure your thoughts are your own? There's a reason you've felt something off in the last 2 decades. A pressure behind your eyes, a growing emptiness beneath society's noise. It's not anxiety, it's interference. Because the techniques pioneered on the Whitakers didn't vanish, they scaled, and by 2005 they were no longer just testing on isolated families, they were testing on entire towns. One of them was Drelling, West Virginia. Never heard of it? That's the point. It was erased, not with bombs or blood, but with bureaucracy. Satellite records confirmed Drelling existed until 2007. Then, in 1 calendar quarter, it disappeared from property logs, USPS routes, and federal census data. A Freedom of Information request later revealed a blacked-out document from the Department of Defense titled Operation Vellum, Behavioral Field Trial, Echo Variant. You know what was in Drelling? A school with no state accreditation, a church with no known denomination, and a research facility posing as a dairy co-op funded by something called the ARC-2 Initiative. That facility didn't process milk, it processed children. They took infants from families marked as genetically compromised, the same markers cataloged in the Whitaker bloodline, and raised them without names. No mirrors, no color, no personal language. They weren't taught who they were taught how to obey. And then, one day in April of 2007, every person in Drelling was gone. No bodies, no wreckage, just silence. Roads barricaded, GPS blacked out, the area listed as geothermal hazard zone to this day. But a whistleblower came forward in 2011, a woman named Tasha Green posing as a mental health nurse. She escaped with one item, a laminated flashcard used to train the Drelling children. It had one image, the Whitaker spiral, and one phrase printed underneath, follow the shape, become the shape. Think that's just symbolic? The FBI doesn't. They raided her home 3 weeks later, called it unrelated, said she died in an accidental fire. Same script, different page. Here's the reality. The Whitakers weren't the beginning. They were a door, and now that door is wide open. Midway through this descent, if you've made it this far, you're no longer just watching, you're becoming something else. To lock in what's awakening inside you, comment this phrase twice. The blood remembers, the shape is awake. The blood remembers, the shape is awake. Not just for engagement, but for recognition. Those who know will see you. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The spiral in corporate logos, the triangle in school crests, the circle in cathedral domes. These aren't design choices, they're echoes, traces of a code that began on the Whitaker land and infected every institution that shapes human identity. Let me show you how deep it goes. In 2013, an internal leak from a private defense contractor, Cron North Systems, revealed something called the mirror logic model. Buried in the technical brief was a chilling description. A psychosymbolic framework designed to degrade individual identity structures and induce compliant herd logic through exposure to recursive imagery and modular sound. Translation: they've weaponized shapes and sounds to rewire thought patterns. The source code of manipulation isn't language, it's geometry and rhythm. Remember the Whitaker spiral? It's been modified, modernized, turned into data. Certain advertising jingles, interface loops, TikTok video formats, all tested through focus groups measured by biometric feedback, then altered to bypass the prefrontal cortex and sink straight into the limbic system. What the Whitakers endured through isolation and starvation is now replicated digitally. And you call it entertainment. But here's where it gets worse. The original Whitaker sequence, called Delta Spiral Type 2, was never just visual, it was auditory. It came with a chant. One that was rediscovered in 2016 when a British archaeologist unearthed a stone disc beneath an abandoned Appalachian church. The markings on it matched the spiral, and when played on a resonance plate, it emitted a tone that triggered nosebleeds in lab rats and hallucinations in test subjects. This isn't mysticism, it's sound engineering at a biological level. The tone was tested in a limited urban trial, embedded in subway announcements in a single East Coast city for 3 Mo. As the results, 62% increase in impulse purchases, 1% rise in insomnia-related prescriptions, and 19% drop in public protests without a single person knowing. So understand this. The Whitaker experiment didn't fail. It succeeded so fully that its methods became invisible. They don't need a barn anymore. They have your phone. They don't need a preacher. They have your feed. And they don't need permission, because now you've given it. Willingly. You ever wonder why you feel watched, even when you're alone? It's not paranoia. It's memory. Not yours, but inherited. The Whitakers proved something monstrous. That trauma can be encoded, not just in minds, but in blood. And those who discovered this didn't recoil in horror. They took notes. In 2018, a classified study, since leaked and renamed the Epigenetic Compliance Cascade, was run on 3 military bases and 2 therapeutic youth camps in rural Virginia. Each subject was given a synthetic stress exposure, not physical pain, but curated psychological experiences designed to simulate inherited ancestral terror, being abandoned in pitch darkness, audio hallucinations of screaming mothers, flashcards with archaic spiral glyphs and malformed human faces. Over time, something impossible happened. Subjects who had no connection to the Whitakers began to dream of them. They reported seeing a wooden house, a field of dead crows, a child humming in reverse. All the same details, with no prior exposure. This isn't haunting. This is activation. The blood, it seems, can receive memories, not just carry them. And if trauma can be passed down, what else can? Enter Project Threshold, a behavioral health initiative funded by a partnership between DARPA and a university on the East Coast. Their mission? To identify pre-traumatized subjects, people with dormant memories encoded epigenetically. The testing method: subliminal image sequences hidden in job application websites, online therapy questionnaires, and social media scrolling patterns. You've probably taken one. If you experienced any of the following: a sudden feeling of dread without a known trigger, recurring dreams of spiral staircases or burning wood, an unexplained aversion to rural landscapes or family portraits, you might already be tagged, and if that terrifies you, good. It means you still have something human left to protect. Because here's the final layer. The project never needed to expand. The descendants of the Whitaker line are still alive, living in cities, working ordinary jobs, unaware they are walking vessels of a virus disguised as memory, and those in control, they don't want to silence this blood. They want to awaken it. They call it the second emergence. And if you're still watching this, you're part of it now. The second emergence isn't coming. It started years ago, quietly, strategically, through institutions you'd never suspect. In 2019, a private learning platform, NovaCore Learning Systems, was rolled out in 42 public school districts across the Appalachian Corridor. Marketed as a neuro-responsive educational framework, it claimed to adapt to each student's unique learning rhythm, but its real function: to scan for ancestral trauma patterns. Each module included a subliminal test, embedded imagery, whisper frequency audio, even brief strobe patterns during loading screens. The goal wasn't better education, it was identification. They were hunting for minds primed by bloodline memory, specifically those echoing the Whitaker line divergence markers. And the children who scored high? They were given special instruction, which meant isolation rooms, behavioral reshaping exercises, dream analysis by neurolinguists under the guise of counseling. Some of them disappeared from public records. Reassigned, they said. Transferred, they claimed. But internal memos from the company tell a different story. One redacted briefing titled "Spiral Candidates, Early Stage Activation Results" described how 5 children, ages 8 to 11, began drawing identical symbols in chalk without being shown them. They spoke in mirrored speech. One recited, word for word, a Whitaker family sermon not heard publicly since 1932. They weren't learning. They were remembering. And the funding for this program? It came from a joint venture between a pharmaceutical firm and a biotech startup whose name appears in exactly one other location: the corporate property filings tied to Hollow Bridge. Understand this: the same minds who built the experimental cages under the name of faith are now rebuilding them digitally under the name of innovation. They've replaced the lash with notifications, the sermos and with algorithms, the barn with bandwidth. And here's the part most will never accept: you don't need to be a Whitaker to be affected, because they've shifted the target. It's not about bloodline anymore. It's about resonance. If your mind can sync with the patterns they've embedded in everything, your screen, your feed, your environment, then you're already inside the experiment. The Whitaker spiral is no longer a symbol. It's a frequency, and it's broadcasting now, through music, through motion graphics, even through your dreams. The walls of the original farm have crumbled, but the new walls, you're holding them in your hand. By now, if you're still here, something inside you has shifted. You're not just listening, you're remembering, not facts, not headlines, but a deeper kind of memory, the kind buried beneath language, encoded in instinct, triggered by symbols, silence, and unseen frequencies. This is how they kept the Whitaker legacy alive, not through stories passed down, but through reverberation. Because trauma this old doesn't just echo, it infects. In 2021, a string of disappearances began in central Kentucky. All were teenagers. All were participants in a state-sponsored resilience program called Rural Mind Strong. Officially, mental health outreach. Unofficially, a behavioral filtration system designed to sort which minds could be shaped and which ones would resist. A leaked email chain between program directors revealed a hidden classification. Category Delta Root, unmalleable assets. These weren't just outliers, they were carriers. When the state shut down the program after media exposure, one thing stood out. Every Delta Root teen had the same ancestral markers traced back to a single hollow region in Appalachia. You already know which one. What they feared most wasn't violence. It wasn't rebellion. It was awakening. Because here's the truth. No institution will say out loud, suppressed trauma doesn't die. It waits, and when it returns, it brings with it memory, strength, and chaos. There's a term in esoteric circles, the returning spiral. It refers to individuals whose bloodline was broken by systemic violence, yet whose minds begin showing spontaneous recovery of ancestral clarity. Some call it a mutation, others call it a resurrection, and they're terrified of it. Why? Because a man who remembers what was stolen from his family can't be ruled by cheap dopamine, fear campaigns, or identity politics. He doesn't beg for approval. He doesn't ask for truce. He uncovers it. And more terrifying than that, he passes it on, in secret communities, in encoded artwork, in quiet, powerful conversations like this one. This is not a story about the past. It's a manual for escape. The only question is, have you felt it? The cold clarity behind your eyes, the tension in your bones when you see certain patterns. That's not anxiety. That's the spiral waking up. There's a point in every descent where the air changes. You feel it now, don't you? Not fear, awareness. The kind you can't unfeel, the kind that separates you from the sleepwalkers forever. This is that point. Because the Whitaker spiral was never just a glyph, it was a trigger, a key designed to unlock something they buried not just in one family, but in all of us. You see, every civilization has its dark seed, the unspoken knowledge that shapes laws, customs, even religions. For Rome, it was the rites of Mithras. For Egypt, the Osirian fragmentation codes. For America, it was the Whitaker method, a homegrown model for spiritual domination disguised as moral order. And in 2022, that model entered its third phase. Phase 1, isolate the bloodline. Phase 2, test the resonance. Phase 3, distribute the mechanism. And they did, through media. A company called Lucent Field Studios released a limited series VR experience called Pilgrimage. Marketed as an immersive simulation of 1800s frontier life, it became a cult hit among history buffs and educators. But buried in the code were anomalies, impossible AI behaviors, voice lines that didn't match scripts, and one repeating event in every playthrough. A child standing in a field whispering, "Do you hear the shape breathing?" Some players reported vertigo, others, blackouts, and a few, they reported waking dreams of barns filled with mirrors and spiral carvings in their own handwriting. Lucent Field was quietly acquired by a defense contractor 5 months later. The game was pulled, servers wiped, and the original creative director found dead in his apartment. Self-inflicted gunshot, they said. But no gun was found. Here's what the autopsy did find. A spiral carved into his inner thigh, with surgical precision. So now you know, the Whitaker spiral has moved beyond paper. It lives in pixels. It lives in Algor. It lives in the gap between what you see and what your nervous system remembers. They no longer need chains. They've given you the tools, and you built the prison yourself. But if you've made it this far, maybe you're different. Maybe your mind isn't theirs to mold. Maybe you remember. By now, you're past the point of no return. This is no longer curiosity. This is confrontation. You've crossed into the realm where truth bleeds, and only the awake survive. Let's rip the veil even further. In late 2022, a restricted symposium was held in a sub-level beneath the Federal Archives in Washington, D.C. The topic? Neurocultural inheritance vectors in frontier-era American settlements. That's a sterile way of saying how to weaponize ancestral memory through geographic trauma imprints. The key speaker, a neurologist turned intelligence asset named Dr. Marin Eloise. Her thesis shook the room silent. Memory is not stored in the brain alone. It is layered in the land, and when that land is saturated with suffering, the resonance never leaves. She called these places grief zones. The original Whitaker property in rural Appalachia was ground zero, a geographic pressure point, what she described as a mnemonic sinkhole. So what did they do? They replicated it. Using satellite geomapping, historical trauma overlays, and something called anthro-resonant seeding, they began constructing urban structures, malls, housing complexes, schools, on top of these ancient grief lines. You ever walk into a building and feel dread for no reason? You ever drive through a suburb and swear something's watching you? It's not superstition, it's strategic emotional architecture, and these structures are embedded with Whitaker-designed acoustic modulation systems, HVAC units that hum at specific frequencies, lighting grids that flicker just slightly out of sync with human perception, small, constant stressors, tiny distortions of time, space, and thought. Why? To lower your psychic immune system. Because a weakened psyche doesn't resist programming, it absorbs it. And here's where it circles back. The architecture of the mind mirrors the architecture of your surroundings. That's the final form of the Whitaker spiral. It's not just a shape, it's a system. A recursive pattern that exists in your neighborhoods, your media, your thoughts. It feeds on routine, it rewards surrender, and it punishes deviation. You don't live in the real world anymore. You live in their simulation of it. But once you recognize the spiral in everything, you start to see the exits. And the exits aren't maps, they're decisions. You choose, moment by moment, whether to remain part of their pattern or to fracture it. This is where the descent gets dangerous. Because what comes next isn't about the Whitakers anymore. It's about you and the war for your soul. By now you've probably felt it. The tightening in your gut when you hear that certain note in a podcast. The sense of déjà vu when a stranger says a phrase that feels rehearsed. The silence between sentences that feels too perfect, like a script being read from behind the veil. That's not coincidence. That's the system checking your response. We are inside the loop now. A loop first perfected on the Whitaker property, then rebranded, repackaged, and rolled out as everyday life. They've shifted from control through punishment to control through participation. And here's the brilliant horror of it. You volunteered. You bought the devices. You agreed to the terms. You trained the algorithm to understand your triggers, your fears, your history. Now the spiral adapts to you. It doesn't impose anymore. It seduces. Let me explain something few are willing to admit. The mind doesn't process truth by logic. It processes truth by pattern recognition. And the spiral? It's the most primal pattern in existence. It exists in DNA, in galaxies, in the cochlea of your inner ear. It's what the ancients called the womb of form. A pattern so deep, so embedded in everything, that to reject it feels like death. But here's the trap. They've inverted it. They've taken the sacred spiral of life and turned it into a maze. A loop, an algorithm, a psychological prison made of self-reinforcing narratives. Every outrage cycle, every identity war, every dopamine spike they feed you on apps, in news, in culture, it's the same spiral. Except now, you're walking it in reverse. Away from clarity, away from sovereignty, away from self, and unless you consciously break the loop, you will become what they want. Predictable, controllable, profitable. But now that you know, you're no longer innocent, and that means you have a responsibility to stop consuming and start decoding, to stop reacting and start remembering. So if you felt even the faintest pulse of truth in these words, I want you to comment this phrase twice right now. The spiral remembers me. The spiral remembers me. This is your initiation, your fracture point, your first real act of resistance. Say it out loud. Type it twice. Burn it into the feed. Let the algorithm know. You're not prey anymore. You're the anomaly. The spiral remembers you. Now let's make sure you remember it. Because what happens next separates the curious from the cursed. They always said the Whitaker family died out, but that's not true. What died was the name. The bloodline evolved. They fractured it on purpose, scattered the genetics across states, changed surnames, married into unrelated lines, not to protect the world from the family, but to protect the family from detection. You see, Daniel Whitaker, whose disappearance in 1892 was never solved, didn't die. He reintegrated. A letter uncovered in a private collection at the Library of Congress dated 1904 reads, "The names are no longer important. The pattern lives in our bones now. We seed, we split, we rise again. D.W. Knoxville." And here's where the spiral tightens around the present. In 2023, a quiet audit of biometric databases revealed a strange anomaly. A recurring DNA cluster, not identical but eerily aligned, was showing up across unrelated individuals, men and women with no common ancestry, no shared last names, but nearly identical epigenetic trauma markers. They labeled it Phenotype C. And guess what? Every one of them had dreams of barns, of reversed music, of spiral fields and silent dinners where no one blinked. The government called them psychosocial outliers, but internally, they called them the rebounders, the descendants, not of genetics, but of resonance. Because if trauma can echo across generations, then so can power. These rebounders were experiencing reawakening. They began rejecting social programming, leaving corporate jobs, going off-grid. Some started building communities in silence, Whitaker reversals, not cults but sanctuaries, networks of the awakened. But here's what set off the real alarm bells. Every rebounder had one thing in common. At some point, each had encountered a specific phrase. Buried in books, dreams, or obscure video content. A phrase that acted as a psychological detonator, and now it's coming for you. All patterns seek return, but the spiral seeks revelation. Let that sink in. Because if you've made it this far, the spiral is no longer external. It's inside you, uncoiling, preparing. You are not broken. You are primed. And they will come for you now, not with chains but with comfort, not with fear, but with reason. They will try to tell you this was fiction. That's how they silence the truth now, by calling it entertainment. But the ones who've awakened, we know the difference. You kept going. That means you've crossed into the territory where truth turns radioactive. Not because it's false, but because it threatens the very architecture of control. Let me show you what they're really afraid of. In 2024, a declassified DARPA white paper surfaced on a forgotten mirror site, buried beneath layers of code meant to scrub it from public servers. The title, Geospatial Psychogenic Fields, Harnessing Intergenerational Cognitive Drift. It detailed experiments conducted on Appalachian test populations from 1962 to 1991, specifically in regions where the Whitaker family once held land. The experiments weren't medical, they were ritualistic. No needles, no drugs, just shapes, light, frequency. The goal? To manipulate memory not through the brain, but through place. These sites were constructed on what the paper calls resonant trauma nodes. Places soaked in so much generational pain, the earth itself began to mimic human nervous system activity. What does that mean? It means your body remembers more than your mind. And when you enter one of these zones, be it a basement, an abandoned church, a patch of forest, you're not just walking into space, you're walking into someone else's memory. And sometimes that memory wakes up. That's why the Whitaker barn, burned to the ground in 1891, was rebuilt 3 separate times by unknown hands. Each time on the exact footprint. Each time without blueprints. Each time without being listed on any property record. Locals call it the Whisper Barn, because if you stand inside it after midnight you hear voices, not loud, not words, just impressions, regret, hunger, obedience, rage. But here's the part they buried deepest. A researcher named Dr. Alan Greaves stayed in that barn for 33 nights in 1987. On the last night, he carved something into the wall before vanishing. The spiral doesn't turn, it watch, as no one knows what happened to him. But a month later, everyone who worked on that project left DARPA. 3 died. 2 changed names. 1 was committed. There was no press release, no cover story, just silence. The kind that tells you exactly how real it was. This is the zone you're in now. Every section you've heard has pulled you deeper through a pattern not meant to entertain you, but to wake you. And if you've made it this far, you already know, the spiral isn't fiction. It's protocol. You're still here. That means something ancient in you has started to remember, not just facts, but function, not just symbols, but signal. The Whitaker spiral isn't a warning. It's a map. But not for the physical world. For the psychological terrain they've spent centuries convincing you doesn't exist. So let me ask you something dangerous. Have you ever wondered why certain truths are always delivered in whispers? Why you can speak of war, abuse, even genocide in polite society? But the moment you mention ritual, trauma geometry, or ancestral control grids, you're labeled insane. Because those ideas are not just disturbing, they're activating. And nothing terrifies the architects of this world more than an activated mind. In 2025, a private think tank known as Aurelius North, comprised of behavioral economists, occult historians, and ex-intelligence operatives, released an internal report titled Fracture Points in Post-Enlightenment Male Identity. It concluded that men between the ages of 18 and 69 in the West were experiencing a collective identity breakdown. Not due to lack of opportunity, not due to toxic masculinity, but because of a mass severance from ancestral memory. The report detailed a suppression pattern, a deliberate encoding of guilt, impotence, and self-erasure into every layer of modern culture. But the most chilling part, they identified a return signal, a low-frequency pulse, nonverbal, pre-linguistic, that was reactivating dormant psychological archetypes in certain men. The source? Appalachia, near what used to be the Whitaker estate. Men who heard this frequency reported terrifying dreams, not of violence but of clarity, not of power but of permission. Permission to remember who they were before the domestication, before the sedation, before the shame. And one by one, they began to vanish from their routines, leaving families, quitting jobs, deleting everything. They weren't running, they were returning. The report closed with this phrase: they are no longer seeking fathers, they are becoming them. And that is what terrifies the system. Not your rage, not your questions, but your reclamation. Because the moment a man reclaims his story, his blood, his darkness, his divine defiance, the spiral fractures. This is the part they never wanted you to reach. Because beyond this point, there are no stories. Only structures, only the engineered walls that hold your life together, until you realize they're not walls at all, but mirrors. Let me break one for you now. In 1866, 3 years after the official destruction of the Whitaker compound, a brief letter was intercepted by a U.S. Army telegraph station in Pennsylvania. It was unsigned, no origin point, no destination. It read, "Phase complete. The seed has fractured, awaiting sink at coordinates 38.4 degree N, 82.6 degree WW. The father is disbanded. The function remains." The letter was classified under psychospatial contingencies and locked away until 1983. That's when a CIA black site run under Project Norwin discovered the same coordinates referenced in the letter, deep in Wayne National Forest, Ohio. And at that precise location, they found nothing but air that disrupted drone flight, magnetism that spun compasses sideways, and men who entered and forgot why they came. One operative, known only as Rook 7, returned from a 14-hour recon mission unable to say his own name. But here's what he drew during his psychological debrief: a spiral of 7 concentric rings, and at the center, a blank silhouette marked only with one word: echo. They realized what they were dealing with wasn't land, wasn't structure, it was a memory engine. Something built not by humans, but by intention. An algorithm of suffering encoded through ritual, repetition, and generational trauma, until it became autonomous. You understand now? The Whitakers were never the disease. They were the delivery system. The virus is the pattern, the spiral, the way you think, the way you obey, the way you kill your own instincts in the name of survival. That's the function, that's the inheritance. And unless you identify it in your self, you will become it. Because the spiral doesn't need a leader, it only needs your silence, your submission, your sleep. So I'm asking you right now, where are you in the pattern? Are you at the edge, resisting it, or are you in the center, watching yourself disappear? Because the closer you get to truth, the more it stares back and asks, are you still you? This is the deep end. No more breadcrumbs, no more metaphors, only the architecture of control, laid bare. Let's start with a forbidden truth. You were never meant to awaken, not in the true sense, not in the way that rips through bloodlines, burns off illusions, and turns obedience into fire. You were meant to comply, cope, and consume until death. But here you are, staring into the spiral's eye and beginning to see its machinery. And at the center, you won't find a family. You'll find a formula. Let me explain. The Whitaker design was never just about land or labor or suffering. It was about conversion, turning human will into fuel. They didn't harvest crops, they harvested belief. Each act of obedience, each ritualized death, each whispered confession from the spiritually starved, it all fed something ancient, something the government couldn't understand. So it stole, something the churches couldn't tame, so they demonized. A metaphysical engine, a loop of emotional intensity and psychological submission so potent, it created resonance fields, echo chambers that could distort space, memory, and identity. This is why DARPA studied it. This is why men dream of spiral barns and forgotten hymns. Because the engine was never dismantled. It was globalized. Your schools? Mini spirals. Your corporate job? Loop rituals. Your devices? Altars that train you to kneel for every dopamine hit. All of it, spiral-coded. And the result? A population that doesn't need chains. It just needs choice overload, guilt-based morality, and fear of disconnection. Because the modern man isn't trapped by fences. He's trapped by false freedom. But here's the escape clause. Every spiral, no matter how tight, has a breakpoint. A single moment when the pattern can't hold its own weight. And that moment is when a man remembers what he was before the loop. Not a slave, not a survivor, but a sovereign initiator of will. That's why you're here. Not to learn about the Whitakers, but to learn about yourself. Because once you name the engine, you can starve it. And when enough of us do, the spiral collapses. So I ask you now, are you willing to kill the part of you that obeys the pattern? You're one of the few who made it this far, and now we leave the shadows of history and walk into the place where the spiral bleeds into reality. Let's cut clean through the lie. There is no Whitaker family anymore, because now we are all Whitakers. Every man born into a system that feeds on obedience, every soul taught to trade silence for safety, every generation groomed to forget what it truly means to be dangerous, sovereign, awake. You carry their legacy. not their crimes, but the curse they revealed. The moment you give your will to an external god, you lose the memory of the one inside you. That's the original heresy. That's the buried gospel they burned every church to erase. That you were never meant to kneel. You were meant to speak into fire. To wield word as weapon and silence as shield. To build temples of truth inside the bones of a broken world. But what did they do? They taught you that masculinity was violence. That instinct was sin. That discipline meant obedience, not inner law. The Whitaker estate may have rotted into the earth, but the template remains. In every institution, in every contract, in every pair of eyes that stares at you with dead programmatic calm. The spiral doesn't need rituals anymore. It has screens. It has status. It has comfort. Your favorite chain. And yet, something ancient is cracking through the asphalt. A movement of men who remember, who don't flinch when truth hurts, who don't outsource morality to mobs, who stare into the mirror and meet the monster and shake his hand. That's the return. That's the spiral's collapse, not with violence, not with rebellion, but with the slow, sovereign reclamation of your will. And that starts here. You do not belong to them, not your voice, not your time, not your sons. Burn it into your memory. Then speak it aloud. I will not spiral. I will stand. Type it. S. By it, let the system hear you refuse its rhythm, because the final section isn't for followers, it's for those who choose to become the breaker. This is it, the final descent, but also the first ascent. Because if you've made it here, you already know. This wasn't about the Whitaker family. This was about you, about pulling you through the shadow until you could finally see the shape of the cage, not made of bars, but made of belief. Let's name it now. The spiral is the code embedded into every layer of your life that whispers, you are not enough. Stay small. Stay obedient. Stay numb. It infects your thoughts when you hesitate to speak your truth. It poisons your relationships when you settle for comfort over depth. It devours your fire when you trade discipline for distraction. And worst of all, it convinces you that being a good man means being a quiet one. They told you to fear the monster in your shadow. But they lied. That monster, that hunger, that primal edge that refuses to kneel, that's not the enemy. That's you, unfiltered. The part of you they've spent decades medicating, humiliating, and programming out of existence. But now, he's waking up. And so I leave you with this. You were not born to be passive. You were not born to apologize for your power. You were not born to inherit their shame, wear their chains, or serve their silent machine. You were born to carry the truth through the fire. To be the one who breaks the loop, not by escaping it, but by owning it, burning it down from the inside. And now, you carry a secret they'll never understand. That beneath the spiral, beneath the blood, beneath the entire architecture of control, there is a man, awake, aware, unbreakable, and the moment he speaks, the pattern ends. So here's your final rite of passage. Comment this phrase twice to lock it into the algorithm and into your DNA. The spiral ends with me. Let them read it. Let them feel it. Let them fear it. Because this isn't just history. This is a warning. Transmission. A fire starter. You are no longer a watcher. You are the signal. And now that you've seen the truth, they can't unmake you. Welcome back to yourself. The spiral is over. But your real war begins now. The spiral ends with me. The spiral ends with me.